Good evening. After you've got that song marked in your songbooks, turn over to Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18 will be where we're beginning in just a moment. For a while now I wanted to do this, but I finally gotten the first lesson together. I wanted to do a little mini-series about some of the churches that we see in the New Testament. As we look at the churches, we should see ourselves in a lot of ways. These are Christians who are striving to please God. And yes, a lot of these churches have flaws, but also these churches will have strengths as well. And both of those things we can learn from, and we can again see ourselves in these churches and make application from our lives. And also it gives us a chance to just learn a little bit more about these churches as well. So I think this will be a good thing for us to do. And the church that I want to start with is the church at Corinth. So tonight we'll be talking about the church at Corinth. A little bit blurry picture you can see in the background is what is left of the city of Corinth. But that is the site of this city that the Corinthian church was located in. And Corinth, as we talk about it, the city, was a very prosperous city. It was the capital of Achaia, which is a Roman province in Greece, which was a Roman province in Greece. And Corinth was situated on the isthmus, which is connected to the Peloponnesus, the mainland of Greece, or connected the Peloponnesus, to the mainland of Greece. And the Peloponnesus, as we'll look at in a moment, is just kind of a little bitty offshoot of the mainland of Greece, and it kind of looks like an island, but it is connected to land, so it's not an island in the technical definition of the word, but it kind of looks like one when you look at it on the map. The isthmus that was connecting the Peloponnesus to the mainland of Greece was used as a passage between the Ionian Sea and the Aegean Sea to avoid 200 miles around the Cape Malea. And so this was used as a shortcut. And because of this shortcut, a lot of commerce came to the city of Corinth as it was appropriately situated. And because of that, Corinth was the commercial center of Greece. And a lot of wealth came to Corinth as such. The population in Paul's day was around 500,000, so quite a large city, especially for that time. Even in today's standards, that's a large city. But in those days, it was very large. And when we talk about the population of Corinth, it was a mostly Greek city. It did have enough Jews to have a synagogue, but it was a mostly Greek city. And as we read the epistles to the Corinthians, we see that Paul's audience seems to be mostly Gentile in the way that he talks to them. Corinth was known for its immorality because of the affluence of the area, the ability of entertainment to come to them. And also there was a temple to the goddess Aphrodite outside the city, which had 100 sacred prostitutes, and people came all over to go to that temple. And so that immorality in the area affected not just the city in general, but also would affect the Christians who are having to fight against that rampant immorality in the city. And so one thing I wanted to show you real quick is the canal that was talked about. The isthmus would connect what is the Achaia out here. Let me show you if I can. Here's what is considered the Peloponnesus. This up here would be the mainland, and then this was the isthmus that connected the two. And there was a canal that was, I'm not sure if it was natural, certainly part of it was man-made, but I'm not sure how much of it. It's called the Dialkos, and that's what people use to bypass going around the Peloponnesus in order for their sailing routes, and so they just go through instead. And I do have a picture of what is left of the Dialkos, this road that was between the two. People would drag their boats through this road to get to the other side of the sea there, the Aegean Sea. So, that is what we're talking about when we talk about the Dialkos. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the church at Corinth. And if you're over in Acts 18, as I hope you are, let's start reading in verse 1. And this is the beginning of the church at Corinth that we're reading in Acts 18. It's talking about Paul. It says, after these things he left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own hands, I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. And he settled there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names in your own law, look after it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters. And he drove them away from the judgment seat. And they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. And then it goes on to talk about Paul taking leave of Corinth, but that is Paul's time in Corinth where he establishes the church. And when we look at a timeline of events, Paul arrives at Corinth from Athens. This is the wrong slide here. Looks like a slide got deleted, so forgive me on that. But Paul arrives at Corinth from Athens and establishes the church there in about 50 AD. And then Paul leaves Corinth after 18 months, leaving Aquila and Priscilla at Ephesus, and goes to Caesarea in Antioch. It says about 18 months, a year and 6 days is the time he spent there, according to Acts 18. The question is, did he spend longer? Is the year and 6 months after God had given him the vision, or was that in total? So he may have stayed longer than 18 months, but it's possible that he stayed longer. After he stayed this time, he goes to Ephesus, and he spends 3 years in Ephesus after he visits Jerusalem first, Caesarea and Antioch. And then he goes back up to Ephesus, and he spends 3 years there from about 52 to 55 AD. Paul wrote an epistle to the Corinthians, predating 1 Corinthians, about immorality in the church. If you'll turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 5, we see proof of this. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul says in verse 9, I wrote you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. I did not at all mean with the immoral people of this world, or with the covetous and swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you would have to go out of the world. But actually, I wrote you not to associate with any so-called brother if he is an immoral person, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. So here he's obviously speaking in 1 Corinthians, a letter that we have that we call 1 Corinthians, but he is referring to a letter that he had written them previously, and he wrote that from Ephesus. Some scholars think that he wrote this about 52 to 53 AD. And sometime after this, the Corinthians wrote a letter to Paul asking him questions about marriage and meat sacrificed to idols and worship, etc. And Paul also receives reports from the household of Chloe, according to 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 11, around this time. And he writes 1 Corinthians about 55 AD, during the end of his time at his stay. In regard to the letter that he wrote, it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1, now concerning the things about which you wrote. So that's regarding the letter the Corinthians wrote to Paul that he was in part answering in 1 Corinthians. And then, during the end of his stay at Ephesus, Paul sends Timothy to Corinth, according to 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 10. It says, now if Timothy comes, see that he is with you without cause to be afraid, for he is doing the Lord's work, as I also am. So let no one despise him, but send him on his way in peace, so that he may come to me, for I expect him with the brethren. And what we read in 2 Corinthians is that Timothy did go on this trip to Ephesus, and he comes back to Ephesus to Paul, and he gives a bad report on the Corinthians concerning their conduct and how they had received the letter. And Paul visits the Corinthians, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 2, if you'll turn over there. Paul visited the Corinthians during his stay at Ephesus. In verse 1, he said, but I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. For if I cause you sorrow, who then makes me glad but the one whom I made sorrowful? He's talking in 2 Corinthians about he's wanting to come to them again, but that implies that he had come to them a first time. And that would have been during his stay at Ephesus, that he comes to them and he has what is described as a sorrowful visit, and he is troubled by what happens there. And then you might have a little bit of a discrepancy here. Some people think that Paul wrote another letter after that. I would be in that camp. That Paul, after he visits Corinth, he writes a tearful, sorrowful letter that is between 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And so this would be, in total, counting 1st and 2nd Corinthians, one of 4 letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, if you subscribe to that theory. It could be that the letter of tears, as it's sometimes called, the tearful, sorrowful letter, was 1 Corinthians. But it does say that he wrote this letter instead of visiting, which makes me think it is another letter. And Titus is the one who delivered this letter. We see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 3. It says, this is the very thing I wrote you, so that when I came I would not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice, having confidence in you all that my joy would be the joy of you all. For out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you with many tears, not so that you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you. So Paul wrote this letter, and he wrote it so that he would not have to come to them again in tears, as it says. And after he told the Corinthians that he would meet them, he would go to Corinth before going to Macedonia, he instead leaves and he goes to Troas. His travel plans get changed a little bit. He goes to Troas, And he hoped to meet Titus at Troas, but he did not find him there. And so he went on to Macedonia instead of going through Corinth, as he said. We see proof of that in 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 12, which I won't read for time's sake. Titus, Paul sends the second Corinthian letter after getting report from Titus. Titus returned to him in Macedonia with a positive report on the Corinthians. And Paul, either 6 or 18 months after 1 Corinthians, he sends 2 Corinthians to them. And he plans to visit them soon after. Now, it does not say this in Acts 21, but we must infer, based on what Paul said and based on what Paul did, that he must have visited the Corinthians on his return trip to Jerusalem. It doesn't mention it, but he must have done that because he was picking up the funds that had been collected for the needy saints in Jerusalem. And he writes to them in 2 Corinthians saying, I'm coming soon, and I'm going to get that, make sure you have the money ready. And so we must understand that he must have visited Corinth at that time. So that's a brief history of the church at Corinth. But the main part of what I want to talk about this evening is what I'll call their problems, but also their strengths. And we'll do this with every single church. We'll kind of look at the history and look at what happened to them, if there's any history that we can dive into. But the main thing that we want to look at is what kind of problems did they have and what kind of victories did they have. Because as a church today, as Christians today, we can learn from these things. Well, as you may know, Corinth was a very problem-riddled church. They had probably the most problems of any church that we read about in the New Testament. And while on some levels you kind of look at that and say, wow, they did have a lot of problems, we don't want our church to be like that, for sure. But at the same time, it presents a very real picture of a church that, unfortunately, yes, some churches will struggle with these problems, but in learning about their problems, we can learn how to correct them, how to deal with them. So what were the problems in Corinth? Well, one problem we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, if you'll turn over there. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And look at verses 10 through 12. Now I exhort you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all agree and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be made complete in the same mind and in the same judgment. For I have been informed concerning you, my brethren, by Chloe's people, that there are quarrels among you. Now I mean this, that each one of you is saying, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, and I of Cephas, and I of Christ. So they had divisions among them. They were dividing themselves according to what preacher or apostle that they liked. Some were saying, I am of Paul, some of Apollos, some of Peter or Cephas, and some were appropriately saying they were of Christ, but we don't know their attitude in saying that. And so they had divisions among them. And I think a major thing that kind of flows into the rest of these problems was they had a problem of pride. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and 18, one of many passages in 1 Corinthians that kind of references this problem, Paul says, Now some have become arrogant, as though I were not coming to you, but I will come to you soon, if the Lord wills, and I shall find out not the words of those who are arrogant, but their power. And so he talks about how they had become arrogant. They had become prideful, as if Paul was not coming to them. And Paul, of course, says, if the Lord wills, I will come to you, and I will find out, if you can match up to what your pride is saying about you. And multiple times in chapter 8 and verse 1, for example, he says that knowledge puffs up, knowledge makes arrogant. When he says, we know all things, talking about the Corinthians. You think you know all these things, but he says knowledge puffs up or makes arrogant. Again, referring to the problem of pride that just keeps showing up in this letter. Another place where this arrogance showed up is kind of a compound problem. They had immorality among them, but also they had lack of church discipline toward this immorality. In chapter 5 and verse 1 of 1 Corinthians, it says, "It is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and immorality of such a kind as does not exist even among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. You have become arrogant and not mourned instead, so that the one who had done this deed would be removed from your midst." He then goes on to prescribe the solution to that problem, that they are to withdraw from that brother, that they are, in his language, deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, and to not keep company, not even to eat with such a person. But their problem was that they were just allowing this immorality to go unchecked. They were turning a blind eye to it. And that was a problem for them. Another problem that they had is they were apparently going to court against one another, according to chapter 6 and verses 7 and 8. Paul says, actually then it is already a defeat for you that you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? On the contrary, you yourselves wrong and defraud. You do this even to your brethren. Paul says, you're going to court against one another, you're bringing up lawsuits against one another. This is not how Christians are to handle their disputes. And it's a defeat for you that you're doing such a thing. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we learn of another thing that they had going on, where there was an abuse of the Lord's Supper. Paul says, "But in giving this instruction, I do not praise you, because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you came together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. Therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for in your eating, each one takes from his own supper first, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you." So they were abusing the Lord's Supper. They were turning it into a common meal. Some were taking their supper ahead of others in that they had things to eat. They had their elements that they brought, and other people did not have. And they were eating till they were full and content and leaving other people out. And that was the problem that they had with the Lord's Supper. There's not a particular verse that really highlights this, but really when you read chapters 12 through 14 of 1 Corinthians, another problem that they had is they misunderstood the purpose of spiritual gifts. They misunderstood the importance of some spiritual gifts ahead of others. And Paul writes to correct that in chapters 12 through 14. In 2 Corinthians, we see another problem start to crop up. Maybe it had been there the whole time, but they have a lack of love and or respect for Paul. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul says this to the Corinthians. He says, "Our mouth has spoken freely to you, O Corinthians. Our heart is open wide. You are not restrained by us, but you are restrained in your own affections. Now in a like exchange I speak as to children. Open wide to us also." And so Paul is saying, you Corinthians, we have poured out our love to you, talking about him and his fellow ministers that were helping him, such as Timothy and Titus. He says, we poured out ourselves to you, but you are restrained. And it's not by us, but you're restrained in your own affections. And he implores them to open their hearts to him and to Timothy and Titus, etc. And part of the reason for that lack of love and respect for Paul is because they had accepted false apostles. In describing these opponents that had somehow crept their way into Corinth, in verse 12 of chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 12, "But what I am doing, I will continue to do, so that I may cut off opportunity from those who desire an opportunity to be regarded, just as we are in the matter about which they are boasting. For such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore it is not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds." So he talks about these false apostles. He says they are false apostles. They are acting like they're apostles of Christ, but they're not. They're actually servants of Satan disguising themselves. And Paul, of course, is writing the Corinthians to try to get them to see that and to understand that and to disassociate themselves from these people. So like I said, there were many problems in the church at Corinth. But I want to talk about the strengths, and I think their strengths, especially the last one that I'm going to talk about, kind of help us to understand how they dealt with these problems. The first strength I want to talk about is a little bit unrelated, but it is a strength that I saw in studying this church, is that they did have eagerness to help. Specifically, eagerness to be involved in the helping of the church in Jerusalem. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 1, Paul says, "For it is superfluous for me to write to you about this ministry to the saints. For I know your readiness, of which I boast about you to the Macedonians, namely that Achaia has been prepared since last year, and your zeal has stirred up the most of them." Now, I realize Paul is doing a little bit of rhetoric and trying to motivate them to be true to their word, but I don't see Paul as an empty talker. If he was boasting to the Macedonians, I believe that he believed in the Corinthians and in their zeal. And if he believed in the Corinthians and their zeal, that would lead me to believe that they were genuine in their zeal, their eagerness to be involved in this. And yes, we know that the Corinthians had affluence and wealth, and maybe their pride played a part in that. But at the same time, I know a lot of times when you see a rich person, the inclination of the rich person is to hold on to their wealth and not to share with others and to gain more for themselves. But these Corinthians, yes, they were affluent, but they were willing to use that wealth to help others, as Paul says that they are. And so that is the strength of this group. And in general, I think their zeal is commendable. Paul talks about in Romans chapter 9 or 10, I believe, Romans 9, I think, that he's talking about the Jews and that they have a zeal not according to knowledge. Well, sometimes I think the Corinthians were like the Jews in that way, that they had a zeal not according to knowledge, but at least their zeal was there. And their zeal was shown in their willingness to take instruction. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, we have an example of this. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 5. "But if any has caused sorrow, he has caused sorrow not to me, but in some degree, in order not to say too much, to all of you. Sufficient for such a one is this punishment which was inflicted by the majority, so that on the contrary you should rather forgive and comfort him. Otherwise such a one might be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. Wherefore I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. For to this end also I wrote, so that I might put you to the test, whether you are obedient in all things. But one whom you forgive anything, I forgive also. For indeed what I have forgiven, if I have forgiven anything, I did it for your sakes in the presence of Christ, so that no advantage would be taken of us by Satan, for we are not ignorant of his schemes. Paul talks about somebody who had given offense, and he claims that this person had not offended him, but rather all of the Corinthians. And some would think that this is talking about the person in 1 Corinthians 5. I don't have a problem with that. Other people would say that it was somebody else that offended while Paul was visiting them. Either way, the point remains the same. Paul says that he wrote concerning this to put the Corinthians to the test, whether they would be obedient. And the implication is that they were obedient. They were willing to take instruction from Paul, and they corrected this matter that had been a problem for them. And you know what is interesting to me is that when you read from 1 Corinthians to 2 Corinthians, there aren't many things that Paul readdresses. Instead, what we see is that most of 2 Corinthians is dealing with a new problem rather than all the old ones. And what I think about that is that we see the Corinthians were willing to take instruction. If you were to put this in football terms, you talk about somebody who's coachable. Somebody who is willing to look at their mistakes, learn what the coaches have to say about them, and correct them. In the same way, these Corinthians, when they received written word from Paul, they were willing to take instruction. Another point of evidence from that, can we think of any other church who wrote a letter to Paul asking questions? Not off the top of my head. But the Corinthians did. They wrote a letter to Paul asking questions about things pertaining to the faith. And they should be commended in that although Paul's letters to them are a little bit harsh at times, although they showed themselves to be a church full of problems, that they are willing to correct these problems and willing to take instruction. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had a situation where you had someone in your life, be it a parent or somebody else, who was always getting on to you, always telling you something you did wrong? I will freely say that I think my parents were critical of me, but looking back, I know that it was for my betterment. But because they were, in my childish way of thinking, always getting on to me, the temptation is to think, well, I'm just not going to listen to them anymore because they're always saying something negative about me. Maybe that's how the Corinthians felt about Paul, that he was always getting on to them. But to their credit, it does not seem that they were saying, well, we're just not going to listen to Paul anymore. Certainly they had been restrained in their affection, but it seems like they were still willing to listen to him. And so, yes, for all the problems the Corinthians had, in some ways they may be better than other churches that we look at down the line because they were willing to correct those mistakes. And so as we close this evening, I'd ask you to think about yourself in your life. Also, of course, think of the church at Spruce Pine. We need to ask ourselves, is there anything in our lives or in the church that is not pleasing to God? We look back at some of these problems. Could we have divisions? Could there be pride? Could there be immorality among us or a lack of discipline? I don't know of any lawsuits, but are people not resolving their problems in the right ways? Is our attitude correct in worship, specifically the Lord's Supper, but is our attitude correct in worship? The same would apply to spiritual gifts. We don't have spiritual gifts today, but they were using those things in worship. Is our attitude right in worship? What about our love and respect for our leaders? Is that a problem? Are we accepting false doctrines and false teachers? Any of those things could be problems both individually and in the church. And the question I have for you is, if we have these problems, what are you going to do about it? If you aren't a Christian and you're looking at the problems in your life, the solution, I think, is relatively simple. Turn your life toward Christ. By believing in Him, repenting of your sins, confessing His name before men, and being baptized for the remission of sins, and remaining faithful to Him all your days. If you are a Christian and you have these problems in your life, well, luckily for you, the solution is also relatively simple. Repent of whatever you have going on in your life. Turn your life toward God. Confess to Him, and He is faithful and just to forgive you. But you need to be willing to admit where you're wrong. You need to be willing to correct those mistakes. If you have any need this evening, won't you come while we stand and sing?